The suitcase hit the marble floor and burst open, and four small piles of clothes slid across the entryway. A man in $1,000 suit stood over them, laughing, while a woman dropped to her knees and grabbed at her children's shirts. He kicked one of them away from her hand. He told her she had 10 minutes to get her brats off his property. She did not shout. She did not cry. She just kept picking up the clothes, one piece at a time, until her voice came out low and steady. Her name was Grace, and she had cleaned that house for 11 years. What she said next made the rich man stop laughing cold, and what pulled into that long driveway 2 minutes later made him wish he had never opened his mouth. Who was really coming home to that manor? Stay with me on this one. Let me back this up, because you need to know exactly who that woman on her knees was before you can understand what rolled up that driveway. Her name was Grace Delaney, and she had cleaned Ashford Manor for 11 years. 11 years of waxing that marble floor on her hands and knees. 11 years of pressing shirts before sunrise and turning down beds at night. She never took a sick day. She never asked for a raise. She lived in the little stone cottage out past the garden with her 4 children, and she thought of that manor as home. Because for 11 years it was. Now here is the thing you have to understand. Grace didn't come from money. Her husband, Danny, worked the oil rigs down in the Gulf. Good man. Big hands, big laugh, gone too soon. A cable snapped on a platform 300 miles offshore, and Grace became a widow at 31 with 4 kids under 10 and $40 in the bank. She had nothing. Nowhere to go. She sold her wedding ring to keep the lights on one winter. She stood in a church basement food line with Ruthie on her hip and looked at the floor so the neighbors wouldn't see her face. That is how far down she had fallen. And then an old man gave her everything. That old man was Walter Ashford. 81 years old, silver hair, a limp in his left leg, and the kindest eyes you ever saw. Walter owned the manor, and when he heard about the young widow from his church, he didn't send a check. He drove out to her apartment himself in an old truck, and he offered her a job and a home in the same breath. "Come clean my big empty house," he told her. "And bring those children. A house should have children in it." Her kids called him Grandpa Walt. He taught the oldest boy, Sam, how to fish in the pond out back, and how to bait a hook without squeamishness, and how to sit quiet and wait, which Walter said was the most important thing a man could learn. He kept crayon drawings on his refrigerator with magnets, and he never took a single one down, so that by the end the whole face of that fridge was a wall of stick figures and lopsided suns. On Sundays he made pancakes for all of them, burned on one side, and pretended that was on purpose. He read to Ruthie when she couldn't sleep. He paid for the twins' braces without ever once mentioning it. When Sam got into a fight at school over a boy who called his family charity cases, it was Walter, not the principal, who sat that boy down and taught him the difference between charity and family, and Sam never forgot the word Walter used. Belonging. For 11 years, that broken little family and that lonely old man healed each other. Believe me, it was a good life. And then, 3 weeks before that morning, Walter Ashford died in his sleep. Peaceful. 81 and smiling, they said. Grace found him. She held his cold hand, and she cried like she'd lost her own father, because in every way that counted, she had. She barely had time to grieve before the black cars showed up. The man who climbed out of the first one was named Preston Vane. 40-something, slick hair, a suit that cost more than Grace made in 3 months, and a smile that never once reached his eyes. He said he was Walter's nephew. Second cousin, really, married into the family somewhere down the line, the kind of relative who shows up once a decade for a funeral and a free meal. Nobody at the manor had ever seen him before. But Preston came holding a leather folder, and inside that folder was a will. And that will, he said, left every brick of Ashford Manor to him. He fired the groundskeeper the first day. That was old Marcus, who tended those grounds for 20 years and had a bad hip and a wife on dialysis. Preston handed him a final check that bounced and told him to be gone by dark. He fired the cook the second day, a warm, round woman named Dolores who'd fed that house through 2 of Walter's hospital stays. And on the third day, he found Grace polishing the banister and looked at her the way you'd look at gum on your shoe. "You," he said, "the maid. You and your litter are living in my cottage rent-free. That ends now." Grace set down her rag. Her heart was pounding, but her voice stayed calm. "Mr. Vane, I've worked here 11 years. Mr. Walter promised us that cottage. Please. I have 4 children." And Preston Vane laughed right in her face. "4 children," he repeated. "Not my problem. You've got to the end of the week." That night Grace sat her 4 kids down at the little kitchen table. Sam was 12 now, old enough to be scared. The twins were 7. And little Ruthie was 4, too young to understand why her mother's hands were shaking. Grace told them it would be all right. She told them she would fix it. She didn't know how. But a mother says those words anyway, because sometimes saying them is the only fight she has left. And after the little ones were asleep, Sam came back out in his socks and stood in the kitchen doorway, 12 years old, and trying to make his voice go low like a man's. "I can get a job, Mom," he said. "I can bag groceries. I can help." Grace pulled him into her arms and held him and told him no, that his only job was to be a boy a while longer. But she cried into his hair because she knew he'd meant it, and because no child should ever have to offer. So Grace tried to fight. And I want you to understand something. She didn't have a lawyer on speed dial. She had a phone book and a half-hour lunch break. She found a small law office above a hardware store in town, and she laid it all out. 11 years, the promise, the children. The lawyer was a decent man, but he was honest with her, and honesty hurt. He looked at the copy of the will Preston had waved around, and he sighed. "It's notarized, Mrs. Delaney. It's witnessed. On paper, it's airtight. This Vane fellow has money and lawyers. You have my sympathy. But that's not enough to win." He paused, then added the thing that stayed with her. "Something about it smells. The notary's a man named Fisk, and I've seen his stamp on 2 other estates this year that went sideways. But smelling wrong and proving wrong are 2 different countries, and you can't afford the trip." She walked out of that office, sat in her car in the parking lot, and did not start the engine for a long time. Now here is a piece you need, because it matters later. Grace wasn't the only one Preston Vane had run over. Old Dolores the cook, the one fired on day 2, had a sister 3 counties over whose neighbor had lost her house the same way not 8 months before. An old man, dead alone, a nephew nobody knew turning up with a folder. Dolores mentioned it to Grace over the phone, just talking, just 2 fired women trying to comfort each other. Grace wrote the name down on the back of a grocery receipt and didn't know why. She kept doing that lately, keeping things she didn't understand. Remember that receipt. It matters too. Meanwhile, Preston Vane was just getting warmed up. First, he shut the power off to the cottage. Middle of the week, the lights just died, and 4 kids ate cold sandwiches by candlelight. Then he hired a man, a big, thick-necked fellow named Dole, to provide security, which mostly meant following Grace around and standing too close and smirking. Dole went through the cottage while Grace was in town, checking for damages, and left every drawer open and every mattress flipped, just so she'd know he could. Then Preston started clearing out the manor. Dumpsters in the driveway. And into those dumpsters went 81 years of Walter Ashford's life. His reading chair. His war medals. The quilt his own mother had stitched. Grace stood at the cottage window and watched a man throw a dead friend's whole history into a steel box, and something in her that had been bending for 3 weeks finally understood it might break. Grace found the children's crayon drawings in the trash. The ones Walter had kept on his refrigerator for 11 years. She fished them out with shaking hands. And underneath them she found an old photograph, cracked at the corner. It was a young man, maybe 25, lean and grinning, standing next to a motorcycle. Around him stood a whole row of men in leather vests, arms crossed, hard faces. She looked closer. The young man had Walter's eyes. She didn't understand it, so she slipped the photo in her apron pocket and forgot about it. Remember that photo. It matters most of all. Because there was something Grace didn't know. In 11 years, Walter Ashford had almost never spoken about his past. He'd built his fortune in trucking and steel, everyone knew that. But before all of it, decades before, Walter had lived a whole different life. Long ago, before the suits and the manor, Walter Ashford had ridden with a club. Hard men, loyal men, the kind the world crosses the street to avoid, and the kind who will bleed for a brother without being asked twice. And he'd had a son he'd raised in that world and then tried to drag out of it when the money came, because a father wants better and doesn't understand that better isn't the same as wanted. They'd fought bitterly a lifetime ago. The boy said Walter was ashamed of where they came from. Walter said he only wanted him safe. Neither of them said the thing they meant, which was "I love you and I don't know how to say it," and so the boy rode off one night and never came back. Walter mentioned him exactly once, near the end, his voice thin and far away. "My boy," he'd said, patting Grace's hand. "Don't you worry. My boy will look after you and those babies. He always did right by the ones who couldn't fight for themselves." Grace had thought he was confused. Dreaming. She never imagined the boy was real. The days ran out the way they always do, fast when you're dreading them. Grace made 2 more trips to town that week. Once to a legal aid office that had a 3-month waiting list. Once to the bank, where a kind teller told her that a person needs first, last, and a deposit to rent even the smallest place, and Grace had roughly none of that. She sat in the lot again. She did the math a mother does, the terrible arithmetic of which child sleeps where and for how long, and she came up short every way she ran it. Friday came. Grace had nowhere to go and no money to get there, but she packed anyway. Because when a rich man with lawyers tells you to leave, you leave. She packed 4 small suitcases. She packed the crayon drawings. She packed the grocery receipt with the stranger's name on it. She packed the cracked photograph without knowing why. That last night, she cooked her children a real dinner on the little camp stove Danny had left behind. Spaghetti, the way they liked it, with too much cheese. They laughed at the table like nothing was wrong, because kids are good at that. Sam caught her eye across the candlelight and didn't laugh, because he was old enough now to carry a little of the weight, and Grace hated that and loved him for it in the same breath. She gave them baths and read Ruthie a story, and tucked all 4 into bed one last time in the only home the little ones had ever known. Then she sat on the cottage porch in the dark and looked up at the big manor, silent and black against the stars. She thought about Walter and the pond and the pancakes. She thought about how a good life can be built for 11 years and unbuilt in 21 days. For one night, everything was still. For one night, quiet felt like safe. It wasn't. She woke to the cottage door banging open. It was barely past 7, gray light, and Preston Vane was standing in her kitchen with Dole behind him, already grabbing suitcases and throwing them out onto the gravel. He hauled Grace by the arm up the path to the manor to make a show of it, and he grabbed the case with the children's clothes and hurled it, and it hit the marble of the entryway and burst open, and 4 little piles of clothes slid across that floor she'd waxed 1,000 times. Grace dropped to her knees and grabbed at her kids' shirts. Preston laughed and kicked one out of her reach. 10 minutes, he said. Get your brats off my property. And Grace, still on her knees, said it one more time, soft. Please. I have 4 children. That's when she heard it. Far off at first, then closer, then everywhere, a sound like thunder that wouldn't stop. Engines. Dozens of them. Grace lifted her head. Preston went to the tall windows, and his smug little face changed color. Coming up the long driveway 2 by 2 was a column of motorcycles. 20 of them. 30. More. Chrome flashing in the morning sun, engines shaking the glass in the frames. And the men riding them wore leather vests, the same vests, Grace realized, her hand going to her apron as the men in that cracked old photograph. She pulled the photo out with a shaking hand and held it up. The young man grinning next to the motorcycle. Walter's eyes. And behind him, those same leather vests, that same patch. She understood it now, all at once. The old man she had loved like a father had once been one of these men. And these men had come because one of their own had died and been robbed. They rolled up to the front steps and cut their engines, and the silence after was somehow louder than the roar. Then one man swung off the lead bike. Big man. Gray in his beard now, but broad as a door, with Walter Ashford's eyes set in a weathered face. He walked up those steps like he owned them. Because, as it turned out, he did. Now, if you're still with me, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button, because what this man does next is the whole reason I'm telling you this story. He pushed open the front doors and took in the scene in one slow look. The clothes on the floor. The children huddled by the stairs. The woman on her knees. The man in the expensive suit standing over her. "Somebody," the biker said, in a voice like gravel, "want to tell me why there's a lady on the ground in my father's house?" Preston Vane pulled himself up. He didn't understand yet. He thought money still meant something in that room. "This is private property. I'm the owner. I don't know who you people think you are, but I'll have every one of you arrested. I have the deed. I have the will." The biker smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "You have a will," he said. "That's funny. Because my father, Walter Ashford, left everything to his son. And I'm his son. Cole Ashford. He let that sit. So whatever paper you're holding, boy, it's a fake." And here is where it stopped being one greedy man and became something a whole lot bigger. Because Preston Vane hadn't done this alone. That airtight will was forged, notarized by a crooked probate lawyer named Fisk, who Preston paid to backdate it, witnessed by two men who didn't exist. And when old folks with money died alone in that county, Preston and Fisk had a deputy sheriff on the payroll who made sure the paperwork sailed through before any real family could blink. Walter Ashford wasn't there first. He was supposed to be their easiest, a rich old man with a son nobody had seen in 30 years. They just didn't count on the son coming home. And you remember that name Grace wrote on the back of a grocery receipt. The neighbor 3 counties over who'd lost her house the same way. That was one of Fisk's jobs too. The machine had been running a long time. It just never once met anybody who wrote the names down. Cole Ashford crossed that marble floor, and 30 bikers filled the doorway behind him, and Preston Vane finally understood that his money could not buy him out of this room. But Cole didn't go to Preston first. He went to Grace. He crouched down beside her, this huge man in a leather vest, right there among the scattered little shirts. And Grace, who had been humiliated and threatened and knocked down for 3 straight weeks, looked at this stranger with his hard face and his rough hands, and she did the only thing she knew how to do anymore. She braced for more. She pulled a child against her, and she whispered it, the same 4 words that had gotten her nothing but laughter. "Please. I have 4 children." Cole Ashford looked at those 4 kids lined up scared against the staircase. And he smiled, a real one this time, soft in a way that face didn't look built for. "Perfect," he said. "This Manor's been too quiet." He reached down and picked up little Ruthie's drop sweater and handed it to Grace, gentle as anything. Then he stood and turned around, and every trace of that softness was gone. "My father wrote me a letter," he said, pulling a worn envelope from his vest. "Mailed it 3 weeks before he passed. First letter he'd sent me in 30 years. His jaw worked once, and for a second the hard face wasn't hard at all. Told me he was old. Told me he was sorry, and that he should have said it a lot sooner. Told me he'd made his real will years ago, and sealed it with his real lawyer in the city. And he told me about a woman named Grace who looked after him better than his own blood ever did, and her 4 kids, and how I was to make sure they were safe no matter what came." He tapped the envelope against his palm. He knew the vultures would come. He just didn't know they'd come this fast or this ugly. Preston's mouth worked. "That letter proves nothing. Anyone can write a letter. You're right. But a will filed and sealed in a law office 2 years ago proves plenty. And the handwriting expert who's about to hold your little forgery up to the light, he'll prove the rest. Cole nodded, and a biker stepped up holding a phone. We've been up all night, Preston. My father had friends everywhere. Cops, lawyers, folks who owed him, folks who loved him, folks who never forgot what this patch meant. Took us about 4 hours to learn you, and your lawyer Fisk pulled this same trick on 3 other families in this county. Old people, dead people, folks who couldn't fight back. His voice dropped to gravel. You really picked the wrong old man. Then Cole did something Grace never forgot. He looked at the children's clothes scattered across the marble, the little shirts, the socks, Ruthie's sweater, and he looked at Preston Vane in his $1,000 suit. You threw those down, he said quiet. Now pick them up. Every piece. Fold them nice. Preston opened his mouth to argue. Cole took one step toward him. And Preston Vane, with 30 leather-vested men watching and nowhere on this earth to run, got down on his knees on that cold marble and picked up a housekeeper's children's clothes, one piece at a time. His hands shook. He folded a 7-year-old's t-shirt badly and had to do it again. Same floor where he'd made Grace kneel not 1 hour before. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She just watched, holding her babies, while a cruel man learned what the floor felt like. That's when the last cars came up the drive. Not Blacktown cars this time. State police, the real kind, the kind Preston's tame little deputy couldn't call off, because Cole had already gone over that deputy's head in the middle of the night. Preston saw the troopers and bolted. He made it 4 steps. Dole, the thick-necked muscle, took one look at the wall of leather and put his hands in the air, done. And then, because a man like that always talks the second the wind turns, Dole started telling the troopers everything, the power getting shut off, the drawers left open, the 3 other houses, all of it, tripping over his own words to save his own skin. They put Preston Vane against the wall and read him his rights right there in the entryway. And I promise you, Grace felt every single word. They had Fisk in cuffs by noon, pulled out of a lunch meeting with the stamp still in his briefcase. The deputy by 2. The whole rotten little machine came apart in a single day. When the last cruiser rolled down the driveway, the entryway went quiet. Cole walked over to Grace. You can put those suitcases away, he said. All of them. This is your home. My father wanted it that way, and I want it that way too. For a second Grace couldn't speak. Then little Ruthie, 4 years old and braver than all of them, walked right up to the giant biker and lifted her arms to be picked up. And he picked her up. And that's when Grace finally let go, 3 weeks of terror breaking loose all at once, and Cole Ashford stood in his father's house holding a stranger's child while the mother wept, and not one of those 30 hard men in the doorway said a word. Sam crossed the floor and stood by his mother, and Cole put his free hand on the boy's shoulder, and Sam, who had offered to bag groceries to save his family, felt for the first time in 3 weeks like he could set the weight down. Now let me tell you how it all landed, because the aftermath is the part that matters. The forge will got Preston Vane 5 years in prison. Fisk lost his license and got more. The crooked deputy went down with both of them. And those 3 other families, the ones nobody had ever fought for, got their homes and their savings back. Every dollar. Because one old man had the sense to plan ahead and one son had the heart to come home. That neighbor 3 counties over, the name on the grocery receipt, got the keys to her house back on a Tuesday and cried on her own porch step. And she never did learn it was a fired cook and a housekeeper with a pencil who started the thread that saved her. Some good gets done quiet like that. Most of it if you want the truth. And Walter's real will. He left the manor to Cole, sure. But there was more. He left the little stone cottage to Grace Delaney, free and clear in her name forever. And he'd set aside a fund, enough to send all 4 of those children through college, every last one. So they never have to be afraid again, the letter said. There was a line in it for Cole, too, near the bottom, that Cole never read out loud to anyone. Just 4 words. Come home, son. Please. Grace read the part that was hers, and after 3 long weeks of holding herself together for her babies, she sat down right there on the marble floor and cried until she was empty. Word got around that county fast, the way these stories do. The housekeeper nobody had noticed for 11 years, and the biker who knelt down on the floor beside her instead of standing over her. People who'd walked past Grace her whole life suddenly knew her name. Old Marcus, the groundskeeper, got his job back, and a raise he never asked for, and his wife got a specialist in the city that Cole quietly paid for. Dolores the cook came back and ran that kitchen like she'd never left, and she and Grace would sit at the counter some evenings and marvel at how a phone call between 2 fired women had turned into all of this. But Grace didn't much care about being known. She'd never wanted that. She'd only ever wanted her kids to be safe and warm and home. Now they were all 3. Cole stayed. Turned out a big house suited him fine, once it had the right people in it. He fished the pond with Sam and taught him the same quiet waiting Walter had. And it wasn't until Sam mentioned Grandpa Walt that Cole realized he was teaching his own father's lesson without knowing he'd learned it. The club came around on Sundays. 30 leather-vested uncles who taught Sam to change the oil in a truck and let little Ruthie sit on the gas tanks and rev the engines till she squealed. And every Sunday morning Cole Ashford made pancakes for the whole crowd of them, burned on one side, and swore up and down the burning was on purpose. Exactly the way his father used to. He never even knew that. He just did it. As for Cole and Grace, no, it's not the story you're thinking. It was something better and simpler than that. He became the closest thing those 4 kids had to a father, and she became the closest thing that hard, lonely man had to family. Walter Ashford, it turned out, hadn't just saved a widow and her children all those years ago. He'd been saving a seat at the table for the son he prayed would someday come back and fill it. And that grand marble entryway, the one where a suitcase holding a family's whole life had burst open and slid across the floor while a rich man laughed, that floor was never quiet again. From sunup to sundown, it was muddy little footprints and dropped toys and kids running full speed in their socks, and nobody ever mopped it fast enough, and nobody ever minded. That first Sunday, Grace walked out alone to Walter's grave on the hill. She stood there a while in the wind. "You were right," she finally said. "Your boy came home. He did right by us, just like you promised." She looked back down at the big house, every window lit, the sound of children carrying all the way up the hill. "It's not too quiet anymore, Walt," she whispered. "Not anymore."